Alright, hello everybody. We're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're finally out of that philosophy thing, but we're still not into the psychology yet. Okay, we'll do psychology next chapter, but before we get to chapter 9, we have to establish this idea. Remember, the philosophers have been asking questions for a long, long time, but the fact is that psychology needs to be in order for psychology to be a science, you need to be able to measure things, and philosophers aren't very good at measuring things. They're good about talking about things and coming up with ideas, but measuring them. And so we're going to find that the physiologists are going to have some interesting things to say, because the physiologist's job is to study, biological functioning. And so this inevitably is going to say, but can we measure can we biologically measure mental functioning, is essentially what this is going to be about. Because if it is a biological thing, then it truly is something subject to science. So I'll talk very briefly. David Kinnebrook is a research assistant to Neville Maskelyne, right? And their job is to measure when a star crosses a crosshair in a telescope, and the guy is consistently off by half a second from his advisor, so he gets fired. You're gone. Okay? Well, this is an interesting thing. It led to this observation led to a couple of questions. In particular, well, first off, reaction time is a measure of internal mental processes, right? The period of time between presenting, and we're going to come back to this reaction time quite intensely, because there's going to be the method which is going to be used primarily by Wilhelm Wundt in his establishment of psychology as a science. So what does this bring up, though? The problem is that the only way we can know the physical world is through our senses. And if Kinnebrook and Maskelyne had different responses, that is, they were looking at the same object in the environment, yet their perceptions were different. They were off. So the question is, who's off? How do we know reality? We don't know reality, because reality comes in through our senses. And look, even this simple situation where you just go, yes, the star crossed the crosshairs, and we don't agree, okay? And so it's a real problem especially for a natural scientist whose job is to describe the physical world. How do you describe the physical world but through your senses? And if you can't trust your senses, what can you trust, okay? So, how do empirical sense impressions come to be represented in consciousness? Okay, and it's physiology that's going to provide the link here. Okay, couple of I'm going to kind of put a pow here, because I want to point out a couple of different places where people are going to say, look, humans are mechanical. They do have laws. They can be measured. Okay, so the Bell-Magendie law says there's two types of nerves. I mean, anything in psychology called a law makes me happy, right? There are two types of nerves: sensory nerves that carry impulses in, and motor nerves which carry them out. Okay, so right up front there are laws. It's not randomness inside. It gets a little better. The doctrine of specific nerve energies. This is Johannes Müller, and Müller said, look, I mean, a nerve the optic nerve that comes out of the back of your eye is designed to transmit information about light energy. And so it turns out that, generally speaking, when your eye works the way it's supposed to, it sends in information about light. But if you close your eye and you press on it, you see light spots, because that's all that nerve knows how to do. It says, here's some energy, what is it? And it just translates it. In theory, I've heard if you apply electricity to the eyeball, it also transmits as light, okay? Because that's all that nerve knows how to do. Well, along this time, this argument was coming across, in particular among the physiologists, of interest to us in psychology, of course, but in the physiological world, and that is, when talking about life, is there vitalism? Vitalism is this belief that, let's put it simply, life is more than just chemical forces and physical forces. Perhaps I'll make a leap here and say, there is a soul. Okay, what happens at death? A soul escapes. What is it that makes a body move? Soul, says the vitalists. Hermann von Helmholtz was a materialist. He was the opposite here. We're going to get to Helmholtz there in the next slide. Materialists believe that there is nothing mysterious about life, okay? It's just all physical and chemical processes. Remember that whole physiology thing we talked about with, I don't know who we talked about it with, but anyway, we talked about it with, like, you can explain the elbow using the principles of physics and fulcrums and levers, and that explains how da 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 da. But according to the materialists, everything, including thoughts, were the outcome of physical and chemical processes. Okay, I said you already. And so here he is. So Hermann von Helmholtz, in fact, did a very interesting. What am I doing? Yeah, a very interesting thing. Okay, he actually Hermann von Helmholtz was relatively poor, and his family he was real smart. It was obvious he was smart, but he just didn't have the money to go to school. So he took a job from the German government, and the German government would pay for you to go to medical school. But as soon as you're done with medical school, you have to go and spend 10 years in the army. So he goes to med school on the government's dime. He comes out of med school and he has to join the army. Now, clearly, Hermann von Helmholtz, genius, and I mean, he is a genius, and his genius is totally being lost in the army here. So they allow him to set up a research laboratory. I cannot imagine. They must not have been at war or something, okay? So they allow him to set up a research laboratory, and he starts studying. In particular, he was studying frogs, and he was calculating the amount of energy that goes in the front of the frog, the front, and the amount of energy that comes out the backside, whether it be through poo or in the form of movement and activity. Okay, and what he concluded was that, look, the amount of calories that goes in is is accountable by the amount of energy that comes out the end. Okay, so he basically took the largest law of the universe: conservation of energy. Energy can never be perhaps you know this or perhaps you don't, but energy can never be created. It's never created. The amount of energy that's ever going to exist and ever will exist is currently present. And what happens is it changes form. You know, you take your wood, you burn your wood, it releases heat. The amount of energy that was stored in that wood is equal to the amount of heat that is released from the wood. Then the heat goes up, and the heat then goes and becomes energy for something. It never disappears. Okay, it always transfers around. And so anyway, he found that this incredibly huge law of the universe applied to animals as well. I mean, how materialistic can that be? I mean, in equals out. There's no soul in there. Taking it further, Johannes Müller had maintained that nerve conduction was an instantaneous thing, that it happened instantly. Okay, you press your eyeball and instantly you see the light. Okay, instantly. Helmholtz said, no, 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 dude. As long as you say this word instant, that's essentially another way of saying magic, right? And then some magic happens, right? And he says, no, we don't have miracles and magic, dude. And so he isolated a nerve that up a frog's leg muscle, and he would stimulate at points, and then he would measure how long before the muscle responded. And he found, the further the distance between the two, the longer to respond. And he concluded that nerve conduction proceeds at 27.4 meters per second. Now, don't get me wrong, I mean, that's not a bad little estimate given the fact that he had that 1800s technology, and he didn't really know that different nerves have different rates of conduction, different animals have different rates of conduction. It depends on how the strength of the input coming in. There's a lot of factors involved, but I mean, here was his point. He was like, Johannes Müller, dude, miracles not. Is no miracles. He said there is nothing that cannot be measured. Okay? Because anything, if you say, you can't measure that, that's another way of saying it's a miracle. And he says, dude, there is no vitalism. It's all materialism. Okay? And so here was Helmholtz's theory of perception. He said, look, Kant had said that, you have sensations, and then categories of thought modify those sensations, and then perceptions. Okay? And that's an interesting thing. He said, no, 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 no. This thing that you're calling category of thoughts, Kant, that's nothing more than a culmination of the experiences that you've had beforehand. So previous experience intervenes and makes a sensation into perception. He said, look, the axioms of geometry are not innate. Not everybody has them. They're a product of the world that you've lived in, the sensations that you've had. If the world were different and we had different sensations, the axioms would be different. And that is a fact, because if you take an animal and they've done work with like kittens, and you blindfold one eye and blah blah blah, blah, or even better, another one, they raise kittens in a room where there's nothing but vertical stripes. Nothing but vertical stripes all around the room. And then all of a sudden later on, when you put the cat in the room after the kitten has grown up, you put the cat in the room with horizontal stripes, and the cat is helpless. All right, it doesn't have it. In other words, the categories of thought aren't there for that kitten, because the categories of thought are a product of the world. In this case, vertical bars on the wall. So individuals that were blind since birth need to learn how to perceive. So, I mean, there's lots of evidence showing that Helmholtz was on track. These categories of thought are nothing more than a product of the experiences that you've had across your lifetime. Well, there was some other work out there. This one was more, physiognomy was more of a, wasn't a psychology or physiology per se, but it was a movement, a belief system, a cultural trend. Remember Zeitgeist, okay? A cultural trend where people believed that by looking at facial features, they could tell something about the character of a person. And it was Cesare Lombroso was the biggest player on this. In fact, he was a criminal justice, or he was in criminal justice, and he went to prisons, and he looked at all the dudes in prison, and he concluded that certain characteristics, facial characteristics and body characteristics, were associated with being in prison. And so he basically said he made reference to the natural-born criminal. And the natural-born criminal can be identified and stuff. And it was kind of a crazy thought, because it's a morality thing. Because it's like, if it was possible, and by the way, some of this, Lombroso is not completely off, because I'll tell you what, there is certain characteristics that do, in fact, I mean, men in prison are not a random group of men. Take a look at them, and they have certain physical characteristics, and those physical characteristics are usually the product of high testosterone levels. So there was something to it. I'm not going to say that they're a born criminal, but clearly body type does allow you to predict certain things, okay? It's a little bit, prediction is not very good, but I mean, there's some amounts of prediction involved, okay? But this physiognomy was very, very popular belief. It was not just within the realm of the academics and the intellectuals. An offshoot of physiognomy is phrenology. And phrenology felt that, the brain had what they call faculties. Faculties are sort of like abilities, okay? Abilities might be a good translation of such a thing. And that these faculties are somewhat isolated. That is to say, here's a part of your brain that is responsible for justice. I don't know. Here is a part of your brain that's responsible for rationality. I don't know. I'm just picking some stuff, okay? And according to the phrenologist, Gall was the original phrenologist, but there are others as well. What they felt was that, of course, everybody's a little different, right? And they could measure, because the brain is like a muscle. And the stronger a faculty is, stronger an ability is, the more that muscle, like, the bigger, more I exercise, big, right? And what would happen is, if you had high rationality, lots of rationality, then that part of your brain where they said was rationality would be swollen and large. It would push up and make a little hill on your skull. And if you had a faculty which was not very good, then that faculty would lead to a divot on your head, because it would, all right. And so they felt that they could read your skull, read the bumps and the valleys and the ridges, and they could tell about who you are, okay? Kind of a crazy, crazy world. But phrenology was Huge. I mean, in this day and age before video games and cable television and internet, people didn't have much to do once the lights went off, or once it got dark outside. So what they did was they'd sit around in their parlor and they'd do. I mean, it was a crazy world because the traveling phrenologist would come around and they'd do a free show. Oh, here's a free demonstration. And at the end of the free demonstration, they'd selling books. And people would buy the books. They would take the books home, and then they would, in their parlor, they would fill in a chart, okay? Because the first part of the book would be a description of which bumps and which valleys and which ridges and which stuff were what. And then the second part would be a chart where you could put it in. And then the goal was to complete the chart, and then you could compare it with other people. Back in the 1800s, politicians would publish their phrenological readings, all right? It would be like... if it was a particularly good phrenological reading, the politicians would publish them in the local paper to support them. Come vote for me because, look, I have high, rationality or something. Yeah, okay, freaky. And it was a little bit freaky, right? But you know what? This stuff isn't really that far off. I'm not going to get into this in detail, but suffice it to say here that there is relationships between brain growth and different faculty and different abilities. Okay, this and there's many other studies like this, but yeah, there's relationships between the way the brain grows and the outcomes of children. Another researcher that was also looking again at these internal processes, starting to realize that you could physically measure, that there was physical measurements that were associated, internal physical measurements associated with external behaviors. And this is Paul Broca. Now, Broca was the physician at the La Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, and he had a particular patient there named Tan. And Tan had suffered some brain damage, and Tan could basically say one thing. He just said the word Tan, basically. So he's like, how you doing this morning, sir? Tan. What would you like for breakfast this morning? Tan to tan, tan. And after breakfast, where do you think you'd like to go? Tan, tan to tan, tan, tan. And it's just, okay, dude. Now, when Tan died, Broca took advantage of the opportunity, and he did an autopsy on Tan, and he found a particular part of the brain that had been damaged, and he was able to conclude that that part of the brain, now called Broca's area, is that area of the brain responsible for the production of speech. Okay, so he's able to find specific brain areas that are associated with specific external functions. Fritsch and Hitzig were actually battlefield surgeons. Okay, they were surgeons out there, and therefore they had access to somewhat of an unprecedented thing. Okay, they had access to the blown open skulls, because at this point in history, the cannon had recently been invented, and the cannon made some particularly nasty battlefield injuries, and so these battlefield injuries led to open brains, and so they had patients that were basically dying anyway, so they're like, what the hell? Let's start poking away. And they were like, you push on here, and the guy's arm's going, no, 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 and you're like, and then if you poke right up here, instead the hand starts going. And then if you poke over here, the guy's head starts going. And they're like, dude, what the hell is that? They found different parts of the body along the surface of the cerebral cortex. There's this area in particular called the motor cortex. Later on, they find sensory cortex as well, very similar. And the motor cortex is divided up in such a way to serve different parts of the body. And different, when you stimulate certain parts, different parts of the body moved. Okay, quite an interesting little finding. So all of these physiologists, okay, remember now, the philosophers were asking questions about how the mind works. The physiologists were discovering that, yeah, you can measure internal stuff. And so all of a sudden, questions of the mind and physiological measures of the mind, and you're like, dude, this makes a lot of sense, okay? Perceptions are triggered by brain processes, which are whatever. And so a science of psychology was impossible unless you could measure consciousness in some way. And lo and behold, the physiologists were providing the techniques to study consciousness. In our next presentation, the last one before psychology is born, we're going to talk about psychophysics, which is really the blending of psychology and physiology, and it's quite an interesting little tidbit, a little side note on the history of psychology, and it's definitely worth getting into. So I'll see you next time on that one.